Perspective is optimized specifically for mobile devices, and it has mobile responsive design built into its structure. One of Perspective's important mobile responsive features is in containers. Containers provide a way of laying out and organizing components within a view. You can think of containers as a box for the content, and the content is like fluid that shifts, moves around, and takes up the available space in that container. The different container types in Perspective support different layout strategies, like the ones we've showed you. But containers aren't the only thing that contribute to mobile responsive design. We have the ability to, for certain components are built with mobile responsive design built into them. There is styling, where we can actually do tweaks based on media queries, and there are docked views that we can bring in and use in very interesting ways. And we'll go through examples of all of these, but the containers is definitely the main one, and the one that is most important to really understand. If you can understand all these container types and how they work, it really helps you figure out which one you're going to use or which combinations of ones you're going to use as you go forward. So there are 5 different container types in Ignition Perspective: the coordinate container, tab container, flex container, column container, and breakpoint container. And we're going to take a look at each one of these in more detail. And that starts with that coordinate container. And this is the simplest container type. And with this, the components they use basic X, Y, width, and height position properties. So we specify that in terms of pixels, where that component is going to be located within the screen and what size that component is going to have. Now, the size of those components can be fixed, or they can grow or shrink proportionally when the view gets stretched. The component size and location are relative to the parent container size and location. So that's one important thing to understand, especially as we're nesting these containers together, that the components are going to be relative to its parent, and that container can be relative to its parent, and so on. But that's just how you want that layout, and each of those parent containers can, everything kind of funnels down, if you will. The components in a coordinate container can also be rotated, which is the only container type that allows that because of the fact that we can organize this in a fixed position. So when to use the coordinate container? Well, for cases when you need components to overlap each other, so examples are labels on top of a motor display, or a sparkline chart that is centered inside of a tank, or adding a component on top of another component as an overlay, that's a perfect example. And for cases when you don't want components to resize, so a lot of times an HMI screen, PNID, or a diagram where each element is in a separate component, and you want them to be organized that way, and you don't want them to be moving around changing things. And so really this coordinate container is for mostly fluid type layouts. As we talked about with fluid layouts, there's typically one breakpoint, and on a larger breakpoint, we just kind of keep the content centered on the screen in a particular size, like an HMI would stay that way. You may not want to resize it. But as we said, it is also possible for coordinate to resize components based on aspect ratio. And so I'm going to show you an example of this one in particular. We're going to look at all of them and show a good example of that. And so we're going to do twofold. One is to bring out, here I have a Perspective project with we're looking at the coordinate container, so an example of that. We are also going to look at that in a designer just real quick so you can see what that container looks like. So here is the coordinate container with all of these, the vessels, the pump and the valve and the pipes that are all organized in that fixed position. And right now it's in a fixed mode, which means that these components are not resizing. And as you can see, we get scroll bars when the screen is small enough or smaller than that content, but that content never moves around, right? Never shifts, never resizes. If you want it to be based on a percentage, then it's a percentage of the component size to the parent size. So if you have a lot of dead space, that ratio will be different, but you can base that off of an aspect ratio, where as the screen gets bigger, these components are going to resize on there. So there are often times where on an HMI screen, you develop the HMI screen for the smallest resolution that you want, maybe 1024 by 768. And as you get bigger, you want that to scale up, get bigger. But when you get down to a mobile device, there's a question of whether or not you want that to scale smaller, but we're going to talk about that later as we combine these strategies together. But again, the coordinate container, real simple, allows us to do the resizing and or having the position being fixed. And really, it's a very, very simple one. In the designer, when you are configuring a project, you can create a new view and you can specify what container type we're talking about here. And on that coordinate container, that is this one here, each of these components simply have a X, Y, width, and height to that position. And on the actual root of the container, there's a mode where this can be fixed or percentage based. And here you can see the aspect ratio that I put there. And the aspect ratio is based on the size that I wanted to design this in. So very, very simple. And this one also in perspective, this is what the coordinate container is what provides the pipes. The piping tool is only available within that coordinate container. All right, so let's look on to the next one. And that is our tabs container. We're probably all very familiar with switching between tabs from years of using web browsers and the navigation that's in there. The tab container gives you that same classic tab strip navigation inside of Ignition. The container comes with two variants. It's classic and modern. And in classic, you can see on this slide, has traditional style menu with box tabs that can change the color based on the tab you're currently looking at. Of course, you can be in complete control of those colors and what that is. The modern version gets rid of the border around each of the tab button, instead indicating which tab you're seeing by simply underlying the title of that. And so it's just the styling of how those tabs work. But with the tabs, only one set of content is visible at a time, right? If I look at tab 1, it's one set of content. Tab 2 will be a different set. So we can have lots of different sets of content within the same view with a very intuitive, very easy way to go between those pieces of content. So a very, very useful container type. And for when we want to use that, it's when we want to keep our information, our components separate, as only one of them are being displayed on each of those tabs. Essentially allows you to have all the components you need without causing confusion by crowding them next to each other or putting them vertically on top of each other as well. So a really great container type that you can use. And so let's take a look at an example of this. So I'm going to go back to our browser here. And so now we're looking at the tabs, and you can see at the very top there are my 3 tabs: process, alarms, and history. And if I look at process, this is just looking at that same view we had before. So this is one piece of content that's there. And then alarms would be my second set of content. So that's using our alarm status component. And then history would be that third set. And so you can see all 3 of these are organized in different sets of content. And these tabs can be dynamic, but ultimately it allows us to, rather than navigating to different screens or whatever, all that content can be accessible very, very easily. An important thing to note that with the tab container in terms of mobile responsive design is that the tabs are going to be there, but the content inside of it can adapt based on the size, right? So this same coordinate container we showed before, is inside here, is going to react the same way in that tab container. And so will other components like that. So very, very simple one in terms of the configuration. We add in a tab container, and on there we can set the tabs that we want. So here we have 3, and we just add new ones. And we can also set which tab is selected, and we can do that programmatically if we want. And we can go between that modern style, as you can see now up there, and that classic style of these tabs. So very, very simple. But if I wanted to add a new tab, something else, let's say, or admin or whatever, you can see that there's the tab in our design environment. We just simply can put that there. Let's say I want to put a component in there, like our dashboard component, and then now that's the content that's in that tab. And so we can drag any kind of content we want in that tab container. So very, very simple for how that works. All right, let's move on to the Flex container. The Flex container is perfect if you need to change the size of the actual components for different screen sizes. The Flex container alters a component's width and height to best fill the available space to accommodate all types of devices and screens. Depending on the screen you're using, components will either expand to fill available free space or shrink or wrap to prevent overflow. Something else that's really beneficial is that the Flex container allows a great deal of control over how components expand and shrink. You can set static widths, making it so that one component never changes size while the other ones around them expand and contract. Alternatively, even scaling lets components to expand and shrink more or less compared to other components. And so this is really a flexible container type. It is based on CSS Flexbox. There are lots of different ways that we can organize, views this way, but there's two modes that a Flex container will have. It'll either have components organized in a column where every component is a separate row, or we organize them into a row where every component is a separate column. So it's either a row or a column. You can't do both, but you can embed in one row, you can embed another Flex container that can be based on a column or a row or something like that. So you can, in the nesting of these become really important. And we'll show an example here in just a moment. So when to use the Flex container. So think of this as your go-to container for designing mobile responsive screens because it provides an efficient way to lay out, align, and distribute space among components even when their size is unknown or dynamic. Anytime operators are not using a consistent screen or device size, you're going to want to typically start with the Flex container. And with how smartphone dominated the world has become, it's incredibly common for a screen to need both a desktop or workstation version, as well as a resized version for iPads and iPhones. It also works for the column drop layouts that we talked about earlier. It's a good one for that. Now, the best way to really show this one is to talk about this one and show an example of it. And so let's go over here to our browser, and we're going to change the size of it so you can see how these components are organized. But first and foremost, before I do that, let's talk about how this particular one is organized. So here is our Flex container, and the very top level of this is a direction of a column. So what that means is that every component is a row. So this first one that I've selected, this is the first row right here. And then the second one is this label is the second row. And then we have that third row down at the bottom. And so you'll note that every row will contain one component. So in the middle, it's this label, but in the top and the bottom, it's another Flex container. And you'll see that this Flex container inside of that is a direction of a row. So there inside of that, we have each one of these being a separate column, right? There's 3 separate columns. So with all of this, with the Flex, we have that ability to specify how these components are going to resize and how they're going to grow or shrink. And so you can see that this very top one, we are not growing, we're not shrinking, and we're setting the height to a static 100 pixels. So that height's never going to vary, but the width most certainly will, because the components inside of that, in that row, we have one that is going to be 250 pixels, but it can shrink past that. We have one that is going to fill in all the available space. So that's growing and shrinking. And then the last one that is just a static. It's not growing, not shrinking, and it's at 75 pixels. So the point here being is that you really can lay out data where you can easily fill in that space and kind of figure out what, have it automatically detect the size of the content, and content can easily scroll, especially vertically on a screen because of this. And so often it's one that we start out with, and we'll talk more about that here. But if I look at this, you can see that that top one, this view here is going to fill in all that space. This one's static size, and this one is 250 pixels until it gets smaller. So let's watch it as it gets smaller. You're going to see that now that one's going to start. This one's going to start getting smaller, and you can see how that fills in that space. Now look at vertically, because we have that. The very top row is staying at a static height. This view in the middle is getting bigger. It's filling in that available space, as you can see. And then the bottom one is also allowed to shrink as things get smaller. So, but it's kind of automatically detecting its content size. So really, really very flexible. That's why it's called the Flex container. But there's a lot of good uses, and we'll talk more about the combination of these things, but often we start with this Flex layout and most of the views that we are building in Ignition. All right, the next container type that we're going to talk about here is the column container. And this container type has 3 breakpoints, small, medium, and large by default. Now you can create multiple breakpoints here. So this is the first one you're going to see where in Ignition you're defining the breakpoints as sizes and how you want these components to adapt based on those sizes. And every breakpoint that you have, there's 12 vertical columns that you can organize content against. You can have as many rows as you want, but those 12 columns, very common 12-column layout for a lot of websites. But what this allows us to do is basically, with a given, it's the same set of components, but with each of those breakpoints, each of those sizes, we can say where we want to position that component and how many columns do we want to spread that across, basically control that position. And so it's really a great one that is just easiest for doing mobile responsive design. So it's a container, it's great when you have the same components on all the screen sizes, but you want their size and orientation to shift based on those new proportions. And on a smaller screen or narrow screen, each component will take up typically all 12 columns and have its own row. On a wider display, the components may share a row because there's enough floors on a room. And so again, this is perfect for column drop layouts where you want, as you get smaller, you're dropping columns down on there. So let's show a good example of this. Again, I'm going to go back to our examples. So here is our column container. And again, before we can show this one first and go and look in the design part of it. But right now I'm on a large display. So you can see how our components are oriented. So I've got 7 components on here. The first 4 are in the first row, and there are different columns there. We have enough real estate for that. This might be an HMI or something. It's big, and so it's taking up that entire row, all the columns, and then you have these last 2 are just sharing sides. But then as I go down, we have different breakpoints. So as we get past that first breakpoint, here we go. Then now you can see that the top, instead of having all 4 of those in the same row, we don't have enough space. So now we've dropped a couple down. 3 and 4 got dropped down here. We've kind of organized those a little differently. And then we get down to even smaller breakpoint. You can see that now everything got dropped into a single column. So everything's now a row. So a very, very simple one. And you can control how you want that to work. Basically, what you're doing on this is you are setting those breakpoints. So here we have 3 breakpoints. We have that large and the medium and the small. And in the designer, you can actually see what that's going to look like. If you click on each one of those, how they're going to change the position. But basically, on each of them, each of these components have a separate position. So if I look at this label here on the large display, that's where it's positioned. And if I go to the medium, right, it's now spreading across. It's positioned in the same place, but it's using more columns now. If I go to small, it's again the first row, and all of the columns are being taken. So all you do with these is specify where you want these things to go on, and you just move around. So if I wanted this into a different row here, and I wanted these to be the full thing, we can certainly do that very easily. And then if I go to the medium, you can see how we can change these things as much as we want for how that will look. So very, very powerful one, very useful. And when we go to the demos, you'll see more examples of this. All right, so with the column container, the layout changes to fit the screen size, but the content is identical. But what if you wanted to redefine, have different content to render for that breakpoint? So as I get down to a smaller size, what if I want that content to completely change? And that brings up the 5th container type, the breakpoint container. And this lets you create multiple versions of a single container using a pixel width as a cutoff, meaning that you can completely change the look or structure for displays on mobile versus desktop. The breakpoint container consists of a single breakpoint with 2 child views. In other words, it gives you the opportunity to create 2 different views that are shown at 2 distinct ranges of layout widths. The breakpoint is configured by selecting the small and large breakpoints at the top and then dragging a view into each one of those breakpoints. So again, we're going to show an example of this, but they are ideal for cases where you want completely different components available between a mobile and desktop. And it's especially for like HMI type screens. We're going to show a good example of this. It is the most comprehensive choice when you want to develop a project that works for sessions of many shapes and sizes. So when operators using mobile phones and need different control options than desktop computers, this is a perfect one to use. So it is really also good for the layout shifter pattern. So where we want things to completely change and shift things around. So let's do a quick demonstration of this one. And let's go back here. And so this one's really simple actually. And you can see that I'm on the large size. And if I get past the breakpoint there, now it is on the small view. So This is nothing too exciting on here. We'll show a better example, but we're just showing two different views for the small and large. So if we look at this in our design environment, we can clearly see that there's a breakpoint, 640 pixels in my case. And on the large display of that, we have this label that's the large view. If I go to the small display, then it's this component that is the small view. And so this could be any component. This could be another container type. So it can have on a large display, it can have an HMI and a coordinate container, and the small one can be a Flex container if we wanted that to be. So a lot of good options for how that can work. So those are the 5 layout patterns and the 5 perspective container types. We saw that you can use the coordinate container for mostly fluid, and the column container for column drop, and the breakpoint container for layout shifter. But what about other layouts, tiny tweaks, and off canvas? It turns out that there are other areas of perspective for doing mobile responsive design. We can utilize name styles with their element states and media queries to accomplish that. Styles are to accomplish tiny tweaks. They're the main way to change the look of a component in perspective. A style class is a group of style settings that can define style elements in one place and can be quickly applied to multiple components. When you create a new style, you can save it and name it and then use it on everywhere that you'd like to use it. And with the fact that it has media query support, the styles can change based on the breakpoints of the sizes of the application, or even the element state, the state of the component for that matter, like if it's hovered or selected or things like that. These are very based off of CSS, within HTML, but it's very easy to define that within Ignition. So let's go look at an example of this. And so here I've got a single label, and on a large size, you can see the color and the font, the size, the choice, all of that is set for that large. But because the media queries, if I go to a medium, you can see that that same label from a styling aspect changed the background color, it changed the font, and all of that. And so here you can see it go down smaller, and now it has a border around it. And so this is really simple to set up. All we have in this is a single label, and that label has a responsive style associated with it. And on that responsive style, you can see that we have a base style with different colors and fonts. And if I look at these media, when it's on the very small display, here's my colors and the border. On the when it gets up to 480 pixels, it's going to have this style. And so we can have these different styles associated with these individual components, those tiny tweaks that we can make within applications. So not only can we arrange the content in different ways, but we can make those tiny tweaks that really help us be in complete control of all of that. Off-canvas layouts we talked about before can be made using docked views. A docked view is when a view is anchored or docked to the edge of a session, and it's how a lot of navigation is laid out, like with the hamburger icon that often you see in the upper corner of a website. These docked views feature multiple properties that alter the behavior of a dock in unique ways. So we're going to show that, but we can have it be resizable, modal. We can have automatically come and show. We can have a handle on these things. The best way to show these dock views is through a demonstration, but this is probably one of the areas that most applications are going to take advantage of not only the different container types, but have these dock views. And typically navigation is part of that. So here you can see I've got this screen that has two dock views, is left view and the right view. And the way this is configured in Ignition, the perspective, is that on this particular page, we have a left docked view with its settings. We have a right docked view with its settings. And so those are not inside of the main content. The main content is a different view, but we have these two on the left and right. And right now, when I'm on a large display, they're showing. And you can see that the left one is taking up its space. It's pushing that main content in, so is the right. The right does have, this icon. They both have that handle if you want to bring it out, even on large displays. But when I go down to a small display, you're going to see that both of those pieces of content, they went away, right? They're off canvas now. And if I want to bring them back, I can bring them back and either push my content, so you can see the main view is now pushed in, got smaller, or we can cover the content where that dock is going to go over that main content view. And so that's typical for a lot of navigation when we do that. So we'll show a more comprehensive example of this. Now, within a perspective, various components like the power charts and the alarm status component, alarm journal component, they have mobile responsive design built into them. And That is, so when you put it onto a screen, you don't have to think about that. That component will automatically have, it's already optimized in that way. We built it behind the scenes. And so you have some control over the breakpoints and specify what that looks like, but these components have it built in. So if I take a look at this tabbed one here, and on the alarms and the history, these two, as I make the alarms smaller, actually, I don't think I turned that one on here. Let's go to history. If I bring in a particular tag, let's say, and add that over, and basically as I go down to a smaller display, you can see that now things got shifted around, and that's all based on that single component. We did that mobile responsive design within that component. So we do that with the more complex components in Ignition there.